Zbigniew, coming back to failure training, been thinking, given muscle is weakest in a positive movement, stronger in the holding, and strongest in the negative. It's true. And I've said this before, should you take things beyond concentric failure, I think the benefit past that point is very, very slight. But with that slight possible benefit comes a disproportionately large inroad to your recovery ability. So I don't think most people, if you truly reach concentric failure, or for most people, even the point, what I like to call technical failure, when your form starts breaking down, where you either have a slight breach in form to where it may not necessarily become safe, or even when your repetitions start getting relatively slow out of necessity because your muscles are fatiguing, I tend to think for most individuals, that's probably about as hard as you have to push the intensity. And that goes back to why I use drop sets, pre-exhaust, forced repetitions, heavy negatives. I add those things in with clients to open their eyes that they're capable of exerting more effort, because everyone's got this kind of subconscious limit that we think, okay, this is hard, I'm done, I can't do anymore. And sometimes you really need to be pushed through that before you have a proper frame of reference with how hard you should really be exercising. So just be aware. It's probably pushing it hard enough. At least for me, I like the idea of knowing that I put 100% of myself into that set, where I am mentally, physically, and sometimes even emotionally exhausted. And if you've ever had a set with a really good training partner, it doesn't matter if it's, leg press, doesn't matter if you're doing squats, whatever the movement is, and you feel almost like you want to cry after that set is done because you just put so much focus and effort into that. I like to try and push all of my sets as far as I can towards that direction. And I don't think that I'm getting necessarily a deeper degree of hypertrophy because of that. I just like that feeling that I put all of myself into that movement in that moment. But I don't think most people have to push it that far. Could we do a set starting with a hold and after that do negative? Yep. So I do that with some clients. I have a plate-loaded pulley lat pull-down machine. And an actual pull-down movement, you're going to have what's called a negative strength curve. You're actually strongest with your arms almost entirely overhead, and you get weaker as that position goes on. Same with a pull-up. But due to the pulleys, if this machine didn't have any minor design flaws or friction or anything like that, you would have perfectly even resistance because the cable is just articulating around the machine and the weight is, getting lifted up as you're pulling the handle down. So that discrepancy between the negative strength curve of the movement and the perfectly even resistance curve imposed by the machine can cause what are called sticking points. And I found that for most of my clients, and for myself included, on that machine, when I'm starting to fatigue, I'll usually hit a point near the bottom, right around my eyes, where it gets a little bit harder to pull through, and then right around the level of my chin. And when I'm doing pull downs, I try and get that bar all the way to my chest. So if you're aware of these things, you can kind of identify some of these design flaws that just happen in some of these machines. Unfortunately, it can kind of give the illusion that you're hitting momentary muscular failure when you're not necessarily. You could just be hitting a sticking point because that discrepancy between the strength curve of the movement and the resistance curve of the machine. Now, you have a few options in that regard. If you hit that point, and I'll get to the rest of your question in a second, I like to hold that position for at least 10 seconds, contracting as hard as you can. Otherwise, you can hold for a couple of seconds, you can let it up, and then you can do another partial repetition to that point. And that's kind of what I was discussing on the training footage video that you did for the Carnivore Crew Facebook group. But given that that machine that I have has that design flaw to where I end up getting a couple of sticking points in that exercise, I found it's more productive with clients to where I just have them do a static hold in the fully contracted position. And then I will have them hold that for between 60 and 90 seconds. And as their muscles fatigue and they hit that point where they're at isometric failure and they can no longer hold it and it slowly start going up, depending on how far they are into that set. This is why I use time under load. If they're closer to 60 seconds, when it gets a little bit higher up, I'll give them assistance to have them pull it back down. and I will make them hold it essentially in that static position until about 90 seconds. And then it'll slowly raise up. So yeah, I think you absolutely could do a set holding a weight at a certain position, and eventually your isometric strength is going to fail. And if that isometric strength fails, it's not like if you're doing a bicep curl, when you reach the point where you're so fatigued that you can no longer hold that weight in that position, it's not like you're going to be able to curl it up at that point. It's going to start slowly going down. And the whole purpose of resistance training is to use the weights or to use the machines to inroad the musculature so you elicit the compensatory response of bigger, stronger muscles. So I do think if you can safely do it, holding a static to the point of isometric failure and then slowly terminating the set as safely as you can, could potentially be more stimulating than a conventional set. Now, I'll admit that that's my speculation, and there's not really a lot of science looking at things like those set extenders. James Fisher and James Steele, and I think Bruce Lowe-Smith did a study looking at those types of set intensifiers. And I think that they found, and I'll try and look this up and put it in the comments if I remember, I think that they found that doing these types of set intensifiers provided no additional benefit, at least in the short-term study that they ran. But it's certainly worth a try. And I had a client back in 2014 that I trained out of my house that we hit a sticking point in his training. And all I had was a power rack and a bunch of free weights. So instead of having him do conventional bench presses, we took 2 or 3 weeks and we just did isometric holds on the bench press and really slow controlled negatives. So he would unrack the bench press. He would bend his arms maybe 10 to 15 degrees, just a slight bit, so we'd actually get some tension on the chest. And he would hold that as long as he could. And then as his muscles fatigued, I would help him do essentially one heavy negative. Then I would very quickly lift it up to the top, and he would do another 1 or 2 heavy negatives. Now, you have to be careful doing that on certain movements because things like a bench press or a shoulder press have a positive strength curve. You are much stronger with your arms nearly straight overhead or straight out during a bench press. So if you hit near momentary muscular failure on a bench press with your arms almost straight, that weight is going to come crashing down. And if you don't have a training partner, and if you're not doing that out of like a power rack where you have the safety bars set up to catch that bar to keep it from falling on you, doing things like that can be extremely dangerous. So I wouldn't recommend doing something like that without being able to properly and safely set that up. But yeah, it's absolutely worth a shot. And after having Matt do that for 2 or 3 weeks, by the time we went back to conventional bench presses, I was able to put like 10 or 15 more pounds on his bench like that next week. So I think they're every bit as effective. But again, I know that's a fringe position, and there's really not a lot of science outside of anecdotes to really substantiate that.